And in this final set of lectures and lecture notes, we want to discuss the idea of the democracy standard that is important to this first chapter of the textbook, but as we talked about, it's important to the entire structure of the textbook because the authors return to the idea of the democracy standard in every single chapter of the textbook. In fact, each chapter ends with a discussion of how does, for example, the media um, allow us to have or not allow us to have popular sovereignty, political liberty, or political equality. They do the same with political parties or campaigns and elections or Congress and things like that. So it is a unifying idea, and so it's worth spending some time thinking about those things. And so first we're going to start with an overview of the democracy standard. And as your textbook points out, that democracy, per democracy, requires three elements: sovereignty, political liberty, and political equality. And we're going to talk about each one of those and how it is a challenge to provide those things. What we'll do is we'll take a look at the definition and figure out that those definitions are pretty straightforward. But then when we think a little bit more deeply about it, as they do in the textbook and as we'll do here, we'll find ways in which that is a challenge to achieve, a struggle, as the textbook points out. But in addition, we also want to spend a little bit of time thinking about the idea of what happens if those three have conflicts among them. That even though we can say that we like these things, that there are ways in which they conflict with one another in sort of inherent ways. If it's true, then there's obviously a struggle. It doesn't mean when we give up, it just reminds us that, again, this isn't a perfect system, but it is one where we need to be paying attention and have that citizen vigilance to make sure that the balance is right, that they're not spending too much time on popular sovereignty and forgetting about political liberty and or political equality, or we're spending too much time talking about our individual freedoms and we forget about the impacts that they have on others, and so it might negatively affect political equality. And so talk about each one of the elements, the three elements of popular sovereignty, political liberty, and political equality, and then think about the ways in which they conflict with one another. So starting with popular sovereignty, as the textbook points out, and as we see here, popular sovereignty has a number of elements. The basic definition is one that says that government policies reflect what the people want. That seems the inherent democracy, and for many people, they would think about that as sort of a no-brainer. That's exactly what we want with a democracy. That's why we have a democracy. But as the textbook points out, and as we want to talk about here, the ways in which that's actually achieved, how do we actually make sure that the government policies actually reflect what the people want, requires quite a few things. And this list isn't exhaustive, but it gives us a sense of the challenges that are inherent in this and how difficult it might be. So first of all, government officials are elected by the idea of democracy. It's the idea of representative democracy. In direct democracy, we would make those decisions directly, but because we have a large society with complicated issues, because, as we'll find out in Chapter 2, the framers of the US Constitution didn't really trust us to make decisions directly, representative democracy. And so in a representative democracy, we want to make sure that the government officials are elected by us, that they are accountable to the system of accountability. And so that's easy to say, it makes a lot of sense, but then it makes you wonder along the lines of what does this say about the fact that the Electoral College is the entity, the institution that chooses the President of the United States. We'll be talking about that more specifically later in the course, but as we know, President Trump was elected by the Electoral College. He had a majority of the vote in the Electoral College, even though he had 5 million fewer votes than Hillary Clinton did, his opponent in the 2016 elections. Some might argue that that government official was not elected by the people. There was an input by the people, but it wasn't in the way that people would often think of it. And this is also true in terms of the judicial branch. The federal judicial branch is chosen by a majority of the US Senate, and they serve for life. And because of that, there is no way for us to hold them accountable for their actions. And so in that sense, they're government officials. They act on behalf of the government. They do roles that influence our lives and influence the actions of the government, and yet they are not elected in any way. They are not held accountable to us. And so some people argue that in this instance, popular sovereignty is not being achieved because of the institutions we have set up. But because it is a tension, that doesn't mean that we say the United States is undemocratic. We might say that that aspect of it is less democratic than we might hope, that we might want. And so in that sense, it's a reminder that we have more of a continuum it is not simply you are democratic or you're not, but it does point out the important challenges that are surrounding each one of these things to make sure that we have popular sovereignty. Similarly, you need to have free and fair elections. That seems to make sense. In order for there to be, if elections are so important to decide who our government officials are, we need to make sure that they are free and fair, that they are elections that reflect the will of the voters. And so I suggest you read the current events bulletin from chapter 1 of your textbook to see how complicated this particular element is. In that one, they're talking about the ongoing discussion of whether or not there was Russian interference in the 2000 election. And so that is one that points out the ways in which having a free and fair election can be influenced by a whole range of factors. Similarly, as we talked about just previously, the idea of photo ID laws. Some people challenge this as saying because there are certain individuals who are not able to participate freely because they don't have photo ID, even though they are who they are, and should be allowed to vote if there weren't a photo ID requirement, it is one in which some are election. It's not a fair election because some people easily have the photo IDs available and other people do not. Sovereignty is that people participate politically, and then this leads to a question of, is voting enough? What other forms of political participation that voting is important if that is the way in which we hold government officials accountable, and if government officials are the ones who actually influence the government policies, then that clearly take a look at whether or not people are participating politically in terms of voting. But that might not. It's in between those elections, 2 years for the House of Representatives, 6 years for the US Senate, 4 years for the President of the United States, in which there are actions being done by government officials and we need to hold them accountable. So what needs to be done in those instances? So part of that we'll look at later in the course of the idea of interest groups, the protest or challenge the actions taken by the government, an important role by the media in terms of providing us with information to know, certainly at election time, but even between elections, of what the government officials are doing. And so we know whether or not those government officials are individuals who would like to keep on the job, or if there's an analogy of hiring and firing. In order for there to be popular sovereignty, as we already have suggested, we need to have high quality information, have ways in which we can find out about what the government is doing, what our fellow citizens are doing, what they're thinking, to be able to make the decisions that we need. And that leads to a question of how do we access that information? And so obviously the media is an important source of getting information for a lot of people, but it's not enough. We also need to take a look at the role of interest groups, that some people join together and recognize that their voices are more powerful together, and so they'll join a group that shares their interests, whether it's the National or interested in gun rights, or it might be the American Association of Retired Persons, which I just got to join, is the way in which individuals who are older, who may be facing retirement and want to make sure the government policies will help them, maybe even achieve retirement, then they'll join an interest group in order to do that. And also political parties play an important role. We'll talk in the course, but there are also ways for us to find out about what government officials are doing, what individuals who would like to replace those government officials would do if they were elected. And so we need to make sure that we have high quality information. But as we can see with the instance of the media, with interest groups and political parties, there is always this question of getting is useful, whether or not it is something that is unbiased. And so again, just like we did with democracy, we're going to go through and talk about this idea that bias is not simply a dichotomy. If things are biased or unbiased. That's often what you hear, particularly in certain sources, of, oh, that source is biased. Or in political parties, you hear that, oh, we can't trust them because they're Democrats, or we can't trust them because they're Republicans. Instead, thinking about the ways in which bias can influence the information that's provided to us. And finally, we need to have, for popular sovereignty, the majority rules. And so that's a basic idea of democracy that you probably had before even coming into this course. And so that seems to make sense, but that leads to an important concern that we might have, and that in our political system, we actually have a plurality electoral system. And that means that instead of having a simple majority is fixator, so that you have a majority agree with the decision, and a plurality electoral system, all you need is the most votes. It doesn't have to be a majority, and if you have 3, 4, 5, or 6 or more candidates running or options on the table, having that many options available means that the plurality could be relatively small. And in a plurality voting system, which is what we have for the elections to the US House of Representatives and to the US Senate, there are ways in which the people who have actually chosen the government officials are no longer the majority of the people. And so that might cause some problems in terms of popular sovereignty, because we might argue that the government officials are not really speaking on our behalf. On the other hand, we also have some important decisions in our political more than majority. For example, proposing amendments to the US Constitution requires a 2/3 majority of the US House of Representatives or the US Senate, or 2/3 of the states. And then ratifying, actually part of the US Constitution, requires 3/4 of the states and only the states. And in that sense, it's a supermajority. It requires more than a simple majority in order to change the US Constitution. We'll talk about that when we talk about Chapter 2 in the US Constitution, and reasons why you would have that, why you'd have a higher standard, a higher bar in order to make a change to that important founding document. But the other way of looking at that is that a minority of individuals can block changes that might be necessary to move forward on certain issues. And we'll talk about that more specifically. But in that sense, we might have challenges because we don't have a simple majority. And in that case, a minority group can actually block what the majority wants. And so that might challenge public. Okay, so we're going to pause here because we have some further discussions of some of the other elements.